Hello, and welcome back to Dreamtime Stories. I'm Hattie, and I am very glad you are here with me tonight. This evening's story involves a manor house on the edge of the Suffolk fens, where the earth is soft and the mist lingers long after the sun has risen. It is a tale of a library that holds more than just words upon a page. It is a story of resonance and the way a house might remember the music played within its walls a century ago. This is a quiet Gothic tale that settles slowly into the bones rather than startling the nerves. There are no sudden alarms. Only the scent of old cedar, the low hum of the marsh wind, and the patient work of a woman named Elspeth. Find your comfortable place now. Let your breath slow, and allow the story to draw you gently down into sleep. There is nothing to work out and nothing to hold on to. Just listen and drift. The appointment reached Elspeth Vaughan during a week of persistent rain that turned the London streets into ribbons of black silk. The letter invited her to a remote estate known as Low-Water Grange, a house situated where the river meets the salt marshes of the East Coast. The request had come from a firm of solicitors who spoke of a collection in need of a steward, a person with a steady hand and an ear for the subtle shifts in a room's atmosphere. Elspeth had spent her years in the hushed corridors of the British Museum, and she found the prospect of the open marshes both daunting and deeply attractive. She packed her trunks with heavy woolens and her most reliable notebooks, sensing that this task would require a different kind of record keeping than any she had performed before. The journey by rail was a long and rhythmic progression toward the edge of the world. As the carriage rocked gently on the tracks, the bustling brickwork of the city gave way to the flat, expansive horizons of East Anglia. The sky grew vast and pale, a wide dome of silver that seemed to press down upon the dark, tilled earth of the fields. By the time she reached the station at Oakhaven, the air had taken on a sharp, briny edge that spoke of the approaching sea. A pony and trap waited in the flickering light of the station lamps to take her the final miles. The driver was a man of the fens, silent and observant, who navigated the narrow embankments with a practiced ease that suggested he knew every dip and curve of the sodden land by heart. The fens were a landscape of horizontals, where the only vertical interruptions were the skeletal sails of ancient windmills and the occasional cluster of stunted willows. The water in the drainage dikes was as still as glass, reflecting the indigo clouds with a clarity that made the road feel like a narrow thread suspended between two skies. As they drew closer to the Grange, the smell of the sea became more pronounced, a mixture of cold salt and decaying vegetation that Elspeth found oddly grounding. The horses' hooves made a rhythmic, muffled sound upon the damp earth, a steady beat that seemed to prepare her for the silence of the house. Low-Water Grange appeared suddenly as they crested a low rise. It was a broad structure of dark timber and ancient brick, appearing to lean slightly toward the water as if listening to the tide. The house was surrounded by reed beds that hissed in the evening breeze, their tall stalks swaying in a synchronized dance that seemed to mimic the movement of the waves. It was a building that had been anchored in the silt for 300 years and had acquired the stillness of the earth itself. The windows were small and many-paned, glowing with a soft interior warmth that offered a stark contrast to the vast, cold emptiness of the marshes outside. Mrs. Startling greeted Elspeth at the gate with a lantern that cast a flickering violet glow against the damp stone. She was a woman of few words, her movements deliberate and sure as she led Elspeth through the heavy oak front door. The entrance hall was cool and smelled of dried lavender and sea salt, with floors made of wide timber planks that had been polished to a dull sheen. There were no grand portraits or ornate decorations here, only the steady ticking of a tall clock and the distant rhythmic thrum of the wind against the gables. Mrs. Startling explained that the master of the house had preferred a life of quietude, surrounding himself with objects that possessed their own internal history rather than outward finery. The library was located at the very rear of the house, overlooking a garden that had long since surrendered to the encroaching marsh. When the double doors swung open, Elspeth did not see the usual rows of leather-bound spines or the familiar smell of old parchment. Instead, the walls were lined from floor to ceiling with thousands of small, hand-crafted boxes. Some were made of aromatic cedar, others of dark sandalwood or ancient knotted pine. Each box was fitted with a small brass latch and a tiny handwritten label that bore a date and a time rather than a title. This was the Unwritten wing, and as Elspeth stepped over the threshold, she felt a vibration in the air that was unlike anything she had ever encountered in a room of books. On her first morning, the sun rose over the fens in a wash of pale lilac and gold. Elspeth sat at the mahogany desk by the window and opened the journal of the previous librarian, a woman named Beatrice Sinclair, who had spent 40 years cataloguing the Grange. Beatrice wrote that every sound ever made within a house leaves a minute physical trace upon the wood of the furniture and the fibres of the fabric. She believed that a house was not a static object, but a living record, a vessel that captured the echoes of footsteps, the murmurs of conversation, and the resonance of music. The Unwritten wing was her attempt to organize these echoes into a coherent history, using the natural acoustic properties of different woods to preserve the vibrations. The work of cataloguing was a slow and meditative process. Elspeth had to learn to listen with more than just her ears. She had to feel the resonance in her bones and in the tips of her fingers. She began to notice that the library was never truly silent. Even in the dead of night, the room hummed with a low subterranean frequency that felt like the heartbeat of the Grange itself. It was a sound that was both ancient and deeply familiar, a grounding force that seemed to anchor the house against the shifting uncertainty of the marshes. She felt a growing respect for Beatrice, who had understood that some histories are too delicate to be captured in words and must instead be felt in the air. She selected a box from the middle shelf, labelled simply August 14th, 1842. Upon opening the lid, she did not find a recording in any modern sense, but a series of thin, porous wooden veins that had been treated with a resin that captured the atmospheric density of the past. As she held the box to her ear, the room around her seemed to dissolve into the warmth of a long-vanished summer. She heard the rhythmic, metallic clinking of a silver tea service being laid out upon a stone terrace, the sound sharp and clear against the distant, low-frequency hum of a bumblebee. There was the rustle of starched crinolines and the soft, melodic intake of a breath before a woman's voice, distant and hushed, began to hum a lullaby that Elspeth recognized from her own childhood. The sound was not a ghost, but a physical indentation in the air, a memory held in the grain of the cedar that released its cargo only when the box was opened in the correct light. The second box she examined was made of dark, heavy bog oak, and bore a label that was nearly illegible with age. This volume contained the resonance of a great winter storm that had battered the Grange in the middle of the previous century. When Elspeth engaged the small wooden latch, the library was filled with the deep, percussive roar of the North Sea wind, a sound that felt like a physical weight against her chest. She heard the skeletal rattling of the window panes and the hiss of sleet against the brickwork, followed by the sudden, sharp crack of a branch breaking in the orchard. The resonance was so powerful that she felt the temperature of the room drop, the air turning brittle and cold as the container surrendered its frozen history. A third box, bound in cherry wood, held the resonance of a spring morning in the kitchen pantry. Upon opening it, Elspeth was met with the delicate, rhythmic sound of a knife chopping herbs against a wooden board. It was a domestic symphony of the highest order, featuring the soft bubbling of a pot on the range and the distant, muffled chime of a servant's bell. There was a profound sense of industry and peace in the sound, a record of a life lived in small, necessary movements. She could almost smell the rosemary and the damp stone of the larder, the box acting as a bridge to a moment of total, unhurried simplicity. It was a reminder that the Grange had once been a place of great activity, and that every chore had contributed to the house's overall harmony. The fourth box, made of rare tulip wood, captured a wedding breakfast from the 1860s. This was a much more complex recording, filled with the overlapping frequencies of many voices and the bright, crystalline ring of crystal glasses meeting in a toast. Beneath the chatter, there was the low-frequency vibration of a cello being tuned in the hall, its strings protesting the humidity of the fens. Elspeth spent hours disentangling the different sounds, noting how the joy of the occasion had been imprinted upon the wood with a particular sharpness. It was a dense, rich texture of sound that required her to close her eyes and breathe in time with the rising and falling of the laughter. Between her sessions of cataloguing, Elspeth turned to the later entries in Beatrice's journal. Beatrice had written of the loneliness of the listener, describing how the world of spoken words began to feel thin and superficial compared to the rich, layered reality of the resonance. She had spent her final decade in almost total silence, communicating only through written notes so as not to disturb the delicate acoustic balance she was building within the library walls. Beatrice believed that the Grange was a giant ear, shaped by the winds and the tides to catch the music of the spheres, and that her role was merely to act as a tuner for a grand instrument. She wrote of the frequency of grief, a low, subsonic vibration that she had found trapped in the floorboards of the nursery, and how she had successfully neutralized it by placing a box of bright bird-song resonance nearby. Her life had been a series of these quiet corrections, a constant smoothing of the house's emotional fabric until it reached a state of neutral, humming grace. Elspeth decided to conduct an experiment described in the journal's final pages. It involved a device made of thin vellum and a single reed from the marsh, designed to visually represent the vibrations of the room. She placed the vellum upon the desk and sprinkled a fine layer of sand across its surface. As the house settled into the evening quiet, she began to hum a single, low note. The sand began to dance, forming intricate geometric patterns that shifted and dissolved with every change in pitch. She realized that the house was speaking back to her, its various timbers and stones echoing her hum and adding their own unique frequencies to the pattern. The library was a conversation that had been going on for centuries, and she was merely the latest participant. To test the reach of the root note, Elspeth began a series of slow, observational walks through the furthest reaches of the Grange. She carried a small tuning fork made of brass, striking it softly against the door frames to see how the house responded. In the drawing room, where the velvet curtains hung heavy and dust-laden, the sound was muffled and warm, suggesting a room that had absorbed too much conversation and needed the clearing influence of the wind. She spent an afternoon opening the windows there, allowing the salt air to strip away the stagnant echoes until the room rang clear and true once more. In the upper servants' quarters, where the ceilings were low and the timber was bare, the resonance was different. Here, the house felt thin and alert, the wood holding the echoes of hurried footsteps and the rhythmic splashing of water in porcelain basins. Elspeth stood in the centre of the narrow corridor and felt the house vibrating beneath her feet. A steady, low-frequency pulse that indicated the foundations were finally holding firm against the pull of the marsh. The sinking feeling that had characterized her first few days had vanished, replaced by a sensation of being perfectly buoyed upon a sea of sound. She returned to the library as the violet twilight settled over the fens, her heart beating in time with the steady, invisible music of the walls. As the days turned into weeks, Elspeth became obsessed with a concept Beatrice had called the root note of the Grange. The journal suggested that every house has a fundamental frequency, a single chord that represents its perfect state of balance. For Low-Water Grange, this note had been lost or obscured by the slow sinking of the foundations into the soft fenland soil. Beatrice had believed that the house was leaning not because of physical weight, but because it had lost its internal harmony. She had spent her final years trying to retune the building by arranging the resonant boxes in a specific mathematical sequence, but she had passed away before the final chord could be struck. Elspeth spent her evenings studying the complex diagrams Beatrice had left behind. These maps did not show the layout of the rooms, but the flow of sound through the corridors and up the staircases. She began to move the boxes, following the instructions with a precision that required her to work in total silence. She moved the heavy, bass-toned oak volumes to the lowest shelves near the foundations and placed the lighter ones near the ceiling. As she worked, the atmosphere in the library began to shift. The air grew denser, and the light seemed to linger longer in the corners of the room, as if the house were holding its breath in anticipation. One evening, while the fog pressed against the window panes like a soft white shroud, Elspeth found a box that was different from all the others. It was made of a dark, heavy material that felt as cold as stone. It bore no label and had no latch. When she touched it, a surge of vibration travelled up her arm, a sound that was not a sound at all, but a feeling of profound, unresolved longing. She realized that this container held the key to the root note, the missing vibration that would finally allow the house to find its rest. She set it upon the desk and watched as the shadows in the room seemed to pulse in time with the hidden rhythm within the wood. She lifted the lid with a slow, deliberate motion. Inside lay a single, delicate strand of wire stretched across a frame of ancient yew wood. As the air of the room touched the wire, it began to hum. It was not a sound that could be heard with the ears alone. It was a resonance that vibrated through the marrow of her bones and the very fabric of her dress. She carried the humming frame to the center of the library, placing it upon the central plinth where the acoustics of the room were most sensitive. The effect was immediate. As the root note resonated, every other box in the unwritten wing began to respond. The cedar boxes released the soft, domestic echoes of centuries past. The sandalwood boxes breathed out the deeper melodies of the manor's history, a tapestry of sound that wove together the joys and sorrows of everyone who had ever sought shelter within these walls. The house began to move. It was not a violent or frightening shift, but a slow, graceful correction. Tea. The slight lean of the floors straightened, and the timber joints of the ceiling settled with a series of deep, satisfying thuds. The Grange was realigning itself with its own fundamental truth, shedding the weariness of the centuries and finding its balance once again. Elspeth stood in the midst of this invisible symphony, her eyes closed, her body swaying slightly in time with the rising tide of sound. She felt the presence of Beatrice, not as a ghost, but as a lingering sense of satisfaction. A job finally finished. A song finally resolved. The music of the library began to spill out into the rest of the house, travelling through the long, narrow corridors and clearing away the stagnant shadows. The root note had anchored the building, turning it from a sinking relic into a permanent resonant monument to the lives it had sheltered. As the night deepened, the intensity of the resonance began to soften into a low, comforting hum. The work was done. The unwritten wing was no longer a collection of fragmented echoes, but a unified archive of the manor's existence. Elspeth felt a tiredness that was as deep as the fens themselves, a physical manifestation of the effort she had expended in the tuning of the house. She replaced the yew wood frame in its box and closed the lid, but the root note did not vanish. It had become a permanent part of the atmosphere, a steady frequency that would ensure the Grange remained upright and at peace. She walked through the house to her bedroom, her footsteps no longer causing the floorboards to complain. The air in the corridors was fresh and held a hint of spring, even though the frost was thick upon the window panes. When she reached her room, she found that the bed seemed to wait for her with a renewed sense of welcome. The linens were cool and smelled of the salt air, and as she lay down, she felt the root note of the house vibrating softly through the frame of the bed. It was the most effective lullaby she had ever known, a sound that promised absolute security and an end to all searching. Elspeth looked out at the marshes one last time before closing her eyes. The fens were silent, the white mist clinging to the water like a soft blanket. The grange stood tall and proud against the night, its windows reflecting the cold light of the stars. There was no longer any dialogue between the house and the sinking earth, only a silent agreement of endurance. The librarian of the Unwritten wing had found the melody that held the world together, and in doing so, she had earned the right to the deepest, most undisturbed rest. The hours of the night passed in a slow, rhythmic procession. The root note continued its patient hum, guarding the sleep of those within and the secrets of those without. The library remained still, the boxes of cedar and sandalwood holding their echoes in a state of perfect balance. The story of Low-Water Grange had been written in sound, and the final chord was one of enduring peace. Elspeth Vaughan slept, her heart beating in time with the house, and the darkness was a kind and heavy velvet that covered the world in silence. And so, Elspeth Vaughan lies in the dark of Low-Water Grange, with the root note of the house humming softly in the very wood of her bed frame. The library holds its silence and its music in equal measure, and the Suffolk fens keep their long watch over the reeds and the river. The threads of sound have been gathered and tied, and the house rests easy upon the earth at last. You may feel that same resonance now, a steady and comforting pulse that invites you to let go of the waking world. The fire has gone to embers, the cedar boxes are closed, and the music has drifted into the shadows. Sleep well, dear listener, until we meet again.